Okay, so this is part 2. Can you hear over there? You right? This is part 2 of the Wild Words course, and we talked this morning about kind of what, why do wild animals function well, and why do wild writers not always function so well? So, about flow and block, and what enables that. And we did a little exercise, didn't we, with sensory impressions and body sensations and emotion, and had a look at that as well. So we also, at the end of that, we talked a little bit about ambivalence, and this feeling that if you're tracking a wild animal, part of you would so want, you could be on a safari somewhere, and you would so want to see these wild animals you've heard about, but the other part of you would be quite frightened, really, because of course, if you come up against a wild animal, it's pretty dangerous potentially, isn't it? And I think the same is true when we're writing. The same is true of trying to write wild words, in that we have a lot of fear, particularly of the kind of the big emotions. Some part of us, unconsciously often, has a fear that if we write exactly what we want to write, exactly what we feel we need to write, that somehow it will be too much for us, or overwhelming, or all sorts of things, or the emotions will be too big, or we'll go nuts. There's a thing about creativity and madness, isn't there? A fine line between creativity and madness.
Give ourselves away too much.
That's the thing.
Or we might expose ourselves is a big one, isn't it? Or that our families or our friends might judge us. Yeah. So there's this huge range of fears that come up for us, and some of which we're quite conscious of, and some of which we're also quite unconscious of often. So we're just going to look a little bit today at ambivalence and how that works in writing. And something I want to say about that is that I feel quite strongly that what we consider the blocks to our writing are actually very helpful for us. And I think the first stage in working with block is to realise that we mustn't set up this resistance, this antagonism towards the blocks. Because as soon as we do that with any realm of our life, we make the obstacles much bigger. They get bigger, don't they? The tension gets stronger, the obstacles get bigger, the resistance gets bigger. It's like if any of you have tried giving up smoking or given up smoking, you know that the more you tell yourself you need to give up, the harder it is to give up. And somehow we have to circumvent that if we're going to work with block, I think. Otherwise we just end up impacting it head on. It doesn't achieve anything at all. So I think it's important, it's very important in terms of how I work to say that I think that everything we consider a block is a strategy that at some time we put in place to support our writing process or our life process. It may be that some of those strategies have become quite outdated. Often something that worked for us 10 or 15 or 30 years ago no longer works for us. But I would say that usually they are something that our body and mind has put in place to support us. And if we start off with that kind of in mind, I think it's quite helpful, because it begins to break down that resistance and that kind of, that sort of sense of tension between the block and the flow. And and it's not so much that we need to smash through the blocks, I think. It's more that we have to kind of reposition them so that they channel the flow, if you see what I mean. And what we're going to use today is we're going to use the water here as an example of how we might look at flow and block. And the first thing maybe to think about in terms of that is the fact that without the sides of the banks of the pond here, should we call this a pond or a lake? What would it be? A lake.
A lake.
I don't want to insult it. Where's the line? Where's the pond or lake? I don't know. Anyway, let's make it feel good about itself and call it a lake. Without the banks of the lake, there would be no lake. So in some sense, we need the blocks, we need the containment in order to make the flow work, don't we? And the same is true if you see any river, how it flows around the stones and over and under and around. It's like without the blocks, we don't have the life of the flow either. We don't have the direction of the flow. So what we want to do with our creative process is try to kind of reposition these so-called blocks in order to provide a channel for our flow. It works more like that, really. It's much more like that than this idea that we have to bash through blocks or somehow overcome them, or that they're major problems. They aren't. Nothing is actually a problem. I mean, everything is there to be learnt from. We have to treat it in a positive light. We have to consider them as things to learn from and things that will take us somewhere. And if we're taken somewhere, we always have an opportunity to make a decision consciously about the next step we take. So it also comes back to what we were saying this morning about the importance of making conscious decisions. It's almost like you can't go wrong when you write, actually, because making a move and writing something will always take you somewhere. It may not take you exactly where you intended, but it will take you somewhere. And I think we also have to trust what we were saying this morning about our innate storytelling abilities. It's like Our body and mind functions through metaphor and through story, and if we allow it to tell the stories, it will do. And as soon as we begin to think that certain things we put in place are problems, we kind of undermine that. Instead we can think about them as things that are there to enable the process to work better. And then we just begin to jiggle them around and see what we can do to adjust them to make them work better for us. So it's kind of about reframing our experience often as writers, I think, is most helpful. So, on that philosophical note, I'd like to ask you to do an exercise, if I may. And the exercise actually there's a kind of shorthand for it on your handouts, those of you who've got handouts, which you can refer to if you forget the instructions. But basically, sorry? If you get blocked. Yes, if you get blocked as to what you're meant to be doing, you can refer to the instructions.